once you take government money, you are an agent of the state. The objectives was to use disinformation and propaganda to influence how education is structured in the United States. The United States wrote textbooks for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wrote textbooks for the United States. I think the biggest eye-opening piece, the most surprising piece, was just how willfully ignorant we were as Americans at that time to not catch what was going on or to not question the value propositions that were being offered us.
Your organization is known worldwide, and we certainly appreciate every facet that you do.
I do believe in what you're doing because I've seen it in my family.
I'm so excited about all the things that, Robert, you guys doing with Classical Conversations. It's been a huge blessing for our family.
Grateful for the work at Classical Conversations. You're a leader and you have been in this movement for a long time.
We love Classical Conversations.
I do feel like I have a debt of gratitude to you, your family, all of CC for just the fruit that has come from CC.
I appreciate all that you guys do, both through this wonderful podcast and also through Classical Conversations, which I am convinced is the best education resource out there. Thank you very much for all that you do for the cause of Christ and for our families and for our children. Really, really appreciate it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another informative episode of Refining Rhetoric. And we are doing School Choice Week, and we are celebrating the launch of my new book, Woke and Weaponized, How Karl Marx Won the Battle for American Education and How We Can Win It Back. And I'm speaking with a lot of the co-authors and people that helped me input the book this week. So be sure to check out all of those episodes and go to wokeandweaponized.com or amazon.com to pick up your copy today. And I'm excited to be here with Josh Pierson. The book doesn't have a lot of Marx in it until the end with the appendix, and Josh was the author of that. And today I'm going to talk to him about Appendix B. So the first 200 pages of the book is kind of the philosophy, and it's very well documented, just history of education. And Josh was kind enough to share his expertise on Karl Marx and communist, and that is in the back of the book. So do not miss Appendix B. Read the whole book from start to back. So Josh, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks again, Robert. Appreciate being here.
Yeah. So appreciate all the help that you did with the book and thinking through the different chapters and being willing to write Appendix B. And I know it just kept getting longer and longer the more you wrote about it. So I joke the first 2/3 of the book's the book and the last third is your appendix just about. But yeah, so we talked about other players, but really it's this philosophy behind Marxism and the communists. And of course, they kind of lost in World War II, and a lot of them got shipped over here. So, but you start Appendix B kind of with this striking claim: the enemy is not at the gate; the enemy has infiltrated our classrooms. And so, can you explain kind of how the Soviet intelligence looked at the United States and how they decided to use education as part of their strategy to undermine our civil liberties?
Yeah, of course, I can go ahead and talk about that. So, how the Soviets looked at the United States is when shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, which ended in 1917, and the Politburo at the time, which consisted of Vladimir Lenin, there was, Joseph Stalin was within that inner circle, and you started, Trotsky was part of the original Politburo, and they were going through their own little purge to form the establishment that was going to be the governing body of the Soviet Union. Which, an interesting point on the Politburo specifically is that when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto and going through all of his philosophical, theological, and dialectical writings, he never called for a Politburo. There was never a specific group that was designed to propel a nation state into communism. So Marx really discussed more of a evolutionary approach that had revolutionary markers over time. What the Soviets did, Vladimir Lenin specifically, with the October Revolution, is they took Marx's philosophy and his dialectical critique, which was a Communist Manifesto, and said, we're just going to do it this way. And Lenin talks about that in his work, What is to be Done, when there was a mass migration coming into Moscow and into the other, primary centers of life in the Soviet Union, or I'm sorry, in Russia at the time. And then at the same token, Russia had, they'd lost in a war against Japan in 1904, 1905. And then coming out of, and then in World War I, they sustained critical losses. And so there was fertile ground for a government shift. And so when Lenin wrote What is to be Done, he was calling for radical change immediately, and said that under no circumstances should an aristocracy exist. And so formed his own group. And through that group, the Bolsheviks took over, which leads to how we got the idea of a Politburo, because it's not necessarily a strictly communist idea. It's more of a Leninist idea. So, there is a link between Marxism and Leninism, but it's important to differentiate as we're looking at the line to critically review both Marx's work and Lenin's work, where that line is between the two. The group that was a Politburo at the time, and quite a few of the names still escape me, but the big three were Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin. They're discussing, they look at the United States and they're discussing how can we overcome the power, the global power that is the United States, because the Soviet Union looked at their revolution as one that needs to be global, that they were going to force the spread of communism, as opposed to the claim that Marx made that over time, capitalism will soon move to socialism. Socialism will then move to communism. And that is the idea of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis that is often associated with Karl Marx. And we can talk about that particular thought process at a later time if you want, but getting to the question that you asked. So we've set up the conditions for how we got here. So in these meetings, discussions were had about how to address the problem of the United States. So what the decision came to was, instead of attempting to overtake the United States economically or to engage them militarily, which the Soviet Union already knew in 1917 that they would take critical losses and lose the war, they decided to use disinformation and propaganda as a means to push the agenda of a global communist idea. And in doing so, they targeted cultural centers, which would be education and academia. And so you think education, that's, compulsory public education, other means of just teaching kids. Academia would be your big universities. We hear Harvard, Yale, whatever. Columbia Teachers College, right? A big university. So that's your academia and education one. And then you have media, which is your news, and entertainment, which is Hollywood. And then you have the focus on policymakers, which would be your political leanings, or even your government, how a government is structured. So when you look at what drives a nation, or what makes a nation what it is, or a nation state what it is, it's the cultural centers that impart the wisdom of that nation to the future, right? So that was the focus. And in looking at how to address each of those, and we're going to talk specifically about the one with compulsory public education, what the objectives was to use disinformation and propaganda to influence how education is structured in the United States. And the author of that was an individual named Willi Münzenberg, who was an active member within the OPGU, is the Joint State Political Directorate. It was the predecessor to the KGB. And so we know the KGB today. There was about 6 or 7 different names that it went through, but that was the beginning of, that was the foundational work, was what cultural centers do we target? And within public education, Willi Münzenberg worked a specific direction to look at how to infiltrate compulsory public education in the United States.
Yeah. So one of the things that, of course, that I can make sense when we're at the Cold War or whatever, that we've got this battle going on. But one of the things that you get pushback on is like, did someone 100 years ago halfway across the world, why do they care? Like, why is their ideology still being perpetrated in the U.S. today? Did they really have a 200-year plan to infiltrate the U.S. or 100-year plan versus, most people don't even plan for tomorrow. So, I mean, I can see why some people very short-sighted versus like the long view of history. So what we hear this like long, the long march through our institutions. Why is that true? And like, why are people still pushing this ideology that, the people who founded it are in this time dead?
Robert, that's a great question. And that is one we often discuss, within, some of the strategic security circles that I run in. And we're looking at a difference in philosophical viewpoints. America typically only thinks along election cycles, which is every 4 to 8 years, right? I know we have the 2-year election that we do for the House of Representatives, but it's every 4 to 8 years. And so you look at presidential policies, they're 4 to 8 year policies. When you look at the works of guys like Karl Marx, Bruno Bauer, and those who, and even the philosophy of Hegel, they're discussing they're discussing a categorical shift in the nature of man. And communism's underpinning is a categorical shift in the nature of man. Whereas in the United States, for the most part, when we were primarily driven by a Judeo-Christian value proposition, we didn't have a lot of shift in the nature of man. Man is here to know God and to make him known. That is, the purpose of man.
Yeah.
And so we had the luxury, I guess I would say, to think along 4 to 8 year policy cycles, like to think along an election cycle. But when you look at the shift that communist ideology brings to the table is it's beyond generational. It's almost transformational, where it just keeps going until you reach a point to where you have to, where another, I'm going to go back just a little bit. It just keeps going. And so what the Soviets were looking at in those meetings and that were occurring on how to address the global power that is the United States, the Soviets knew that even if they lose, this was an ideology that needed to continue because they believed that communism is the future. And so even though the United States has is a constitutional republic that is designed around individual identity, individual sovereignty, and how we integrate into our communities and into society, which is more based on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea of the social contract, which puts more emphasis on the individual's negotiation power into society. Communism states that Leninist communism states it all just needs to be imposed upon a group of people right now and change will occur. Knowing they couldn't do that on the US, they said, okay, even if the Soviet Union falls, what can we do to ensure that we can diminish the standing of the United States and potentially get them on the walk or on the march to communism? Mao Zedong also had the same thought process when he was going through his arduous march to, move the Republic of China into the People's Republic of China. And even then, China has a 1,000-year plan.
Yeah.
We have an 8-year plan, if we're lucky. Yeah. They have a 1,000-year plan. And so the idea of communism is that you're looking, it sounds altruistic in a way. It's like, well, why aren't we going in this direction? Well, we're not going. Why we shouldn't go in this direction is because communism starts with the idea that everything is based off of random chance, that there is no God. And that is one of the critical points of communism is that it is founded in dialectical materialism. Essentially that, things come together, they create friction. And then after that friction, there's a new thing.
Yeah.
And then that new thing creates friction, and then there's a new thing, and that's all random, right? And so even though it might sound altruistic, it's really not. It's a means of control and collectivization. Whereas when you look at the American idea of community, we choose to integrate into a community. Whereas in communism, you are forced to go into that community. And so in these meetings of the early Politburo, that even though Russia was coming out of really hard times with their with their economic critique, and change could be stated that it needed to occur, these men said our next enemy, and the main enemy, which was what the United States was called in 1917, the main enemy is the United States. And even if we lose, the Soviet Union loses, we need to ensure we diminish their power.
Yeah. So even as we're Americans here today, 1917, United States looked much different. Like the primary enemy of Marxism or Leninism, and Robert Owen called it private property, is kind of that general thought. Is there an enemy of private property? In the United States, we didn't have the Federal Reserve at that point. We didn't have, taxes were almost non-existent, at least at a federal level, compared to today, the size of the federal government. And so they needed really in their minds, it was an idea whose time had come or was going to come. And so they weren't necessarily about their own power, although certainly they were, but they're married to this idea of evangelizing the whole world under this communist indoctrination. And so that's why they're okay generation after generation taking these steps. You mentioned I think before we move on from this, I'd like to hit the point about private property. And we have to understand the mindset of the 18th and 19th century, when these ideas of property were starting to abound. In the United States, the idea of private property is, what can I do with my land to produce not only for the benefit of myself, but for the benefit of my community, right? That was one of the critical sticking points of our founding fathers. Is they saw how Europe was doing it. Yeah.
They saw the madness Europe was going through and said, no, we need another approach, so that we are not setting ourselves up to oppress future generations, to oppress our posterity under the burden of different taxation rights, different property rights, how to integrate into a community. So what was going on in the 18th century in the 18th and 19th century, but I'm going to speak specifically in the 19th century, because Karl Marx, in his third volume of Capital, is writing a critique not of capitalism as a whole at that time, but specifically on what was happening in England in the 19th century, in the level of waste and the level of abuse that was happening to your wage worker. And so property is more than just the ground you stand on. It became the factory, the machine, the wage that the worker's trying to earn, the hours the worker puts in, all that was deemed property. And so we have two different definitions of property. We have property as we see it in the 21st century, which, even as our founding fathers saw it in the 18th century, which is the land you are on. And this was one of the sticking points with the question of slavery, and why it led to the Civil War, was the United States, the Union in particular, stood up and stated, you can't own people.
Yeah.
And at the same time that this issue of slavery was being addressed, so was the issue of paltry wages for the wage earner that was living in the North at the time as well. Mm. And so you had a clash of different issues about the definition of property. Now, when you look at how property is defined, it's if you talk specifically about the land, right, it's a completely different definition than what we're looking at in the 19th century, with how that definition just grew to cover anything and everything that the capitalist or the capitalist architecture could control. Mm. Does Does that make sense?
Well, you're saying that that our time is part of our property, our efforts, and all of those things. Is that what we're looking at today, and not just the land that you're on? So
in the 19th century, in the 18th to 19th century, what as a layer, and even now, right? Like if I were to come and work for classical conversations, what I'm coming to negotiate with is what I can provide. Marx called it labor power, right? And over time, what I am earning, what I am gaining a paycheck from is labor given, right?
Yeah.
So that's the contract where, you start seeing people say, I'm not earning enough for what I do. And then we get into the whole argument of, should somebody, who's flipping burgers make $15 an hour? And what is the value of labor, right? And that is the critique that Karl Marx addresses in the majority of his works, right? But what he was critiquing is that in the 21st century, if I come to classical conversations to look for employment, it's a different type of negotiation. It's more of two players that are on the same that are like on equal footing. In the 19th century, it wasn't. It was skewed. Like you had capitalists, you had wage earners,
and part of that was you couldn't move.
You couldn't move,
right? You couldn't leave your city to go really to a better place. So.
Exactly. That was a big one. And then there was no real chance for advancement, right? So, and so that's the difference is, now, especially in the US, we have more latitude to move. I would also say in Europe, you have that same latitude to move, to seek better, more greener pastures if it's not working out. However, back then, you're right. You were just kind of stuck. And
that's part of the reason why people, not we are fighting against, but they want a one world government is so that you don't have that freedom of moving to a better place that treats you better if we're all doing whatever the United Nations is telling us to do. So
exactly.
So Willi, his name's spelled Willi, but it's Willi Münzenberg. So you mentioned him before, but he's been the architect of the message. And most Americans probably don't even know his name. So who is he, and why does his creed still echo in today's classroom? So
Willi Münzenberg was the architect of the disinformation campaign that was designed to infiltrate into, the social circles, the cultural centers, right? So a little bit of background. I'm a retiring, active duty soldier, and so I just want to take a minute to say what I'm saying here is my views based off of the research I did and not in any way affiliated with DOD, the USIC, DOW, the USIC, and, all the other, parts of government.
You're speaking on your own.
I was speaking on my own. Yeah. And so, within my profession, 25 years as a counterintelligence agent, we look for relationships of conspiracy. That's how you find spies. Right. Everybody talks about, it's just one grandiose conspiracy theory. Well, that's what espionage is, right? Yeah. So is disinformation. So is propaganda. And so even though we may not be able to specifically pinpoint the actual individual that is the willing accomplice that may have been one of the many or few that helped to drive the message, we can still watch the message trace, right? So just like, you hear follow the money.
Yeah.
Well, in the disinformation game, the money may be a trip somewhere, John Dewey going to Soviet Russia, it could be meeting some famous people that Willi Münzenberg might have, access to. And so following the money it's extremely difficult. So you have to follow the message to try to figure out origination. And so what Willi Münzenberg did when it was the OPGU is used Soviet diplomacy centers in the U.S. and also used non-official cover agents, which means these are individuals that the Soviet Union would deny that they ever knew, or even if they existed, if they were ever captured for doing what they were doing, and had those individuals build relationships within the academia and education cultural center. And it is through those relationships that you start seeing the message of, and I think in the book I talk about, it's like 10 rules or 10 guidelines that Willi Münzenberg gives, which is, say that you're not really that intellectually driven, but you're looking at the Soviet Union and you're glad to see the little guys getting a chance, right? You know, that the wage earners getting a chance in the Soviet Union, or that it's a great project, or that the United States is extremely racist and is seeking to oppress everyone and anyone. These are all parts of that Münzenberg creed that, were picked up and, pushed out. And we see markers of this across our,
we see that today. Well, because we're recording this at the end of the year, Tim Walz in Somalia, there's billions of dollars that have been funneled out of his state, meant to help poor Minnesotans, instead are going overseas, most likely it appears. And he's on the news saying it's white racism that's causing these things to happen. Is that part of Willi's plan?
That would be part of the Münzenberg Creed that was established in 1917. Established is wrong, crafted in 1917. And Willi Münzenberg's, life ended abruptly around 1935, 36 during the Stalinist purge, when he was found strung up from a tree under mysterious circumstances in France.
We don't have anyone committing mysterious suicide here in the United States. Thank God. So this guy over 110, 15 years ago put these ideas together, and they've been infiltrating our teachers' colleges and then our education system, because that was one of those pinnacles they looked at. So tell us, the Columbia Teachers College plays a pivotal role in your research. You wrote that essentially became a venue for KGB covert influence operations. So tell us how the Columbia Teachers College became this infiltrated institution.
So Horace Mann and John Dewey and George Counts all came from the Columbia Teachers College. And although the two that we can trace that had relationships with the Soviet Union are George Counts and John Dewey, because I believe both of them took a trip. I know George Counts did. I believe John Dewey did as well. And so both of them were classically educated, but they were brought up in under a Protestant liberal mindset, which in the 19th century is different than Protestant liberal in the 21st century. So Protestant liberal in the 19th century essentially meant atheist, right? However, since the term atheist wasn't popular and it was kind of discussed in, like secret circles or over a bourbon or whatever, the term was Protestant liberal. Karl Marx was also a Protestant liberal, right? So it was groups of intellectuals who were approaching or were experiencing and learning about something that is known as positivism, which essentially means that through empirical evidence of sensory response, like, a human does something and we're able to take a data point on it, right? Whatever that sensory interaction you have is what describes your worldview and makes you who you are. So essentially, as existence precedes essence, as opposed to Christianity says essence precedes existence. God first, then us, right? So John Dewey and George Counts were both Protestant liberals in the 19th century definition.
So atheists. Refer to them as atheists.
So we're moving to that now. So they would be deemed atheists in today's language. And so we're going to use that in today's language, right? So John Dewey, under his classical education, learned, Greek, Latin, all the, the great things that Classical Conversations puts together for parents to teach. And then we talk about in our community days, grew over time more and more atheist in his leanings. And then as he gained prominence or started to grow in prominence with his radical educational ideas, which were derived from Horace Mann and Robert Owen, the Soviet Union took notice, right? And so as they take notice and they approach him and, and it's through, so you would have Willi Münzenberg to Soviet, operator, Soviet intel officer, essentially, Soviet intel officer to, an individual who's friendly or individuals who are friendly to the Soviet Union. And then they approach John Dewey, right? So John Dewey has this, a series of conversations about a couple articles that he wrote. I think I quoted in the book, and essentially what's stated is he's invited to the Soviet Union to go experience how they do education. Because he's writing about this idea that the United States needs to adopt compulsory education, which the government imposes on the public. And this would be a great idea because it would move the United States from a more agrarian, agriculturally focused society to an industrial nation. So we see that industrial revolution talk coming into the United States around this time. And so John Dewey takes a trip to the Soviet Union, and essentially what happens in the Soviet Union is they create a series of Potemkin villages. Now, a Potemkin village is essentially, a mock-up of something that's fake, but it's designed to make the person experiencing it believe that it's real, right? So the person who it's named for, Gregory Potemkin, allegedly, and it's more myth now as historians have approached it, although I'm not sure if it's revisionist that it's myth. I haven't done a lot of research on Potemkin villages, but essentially what happens is when I think it was Tsar Catherine the Great was traveling around New Russia, which is now modern day southern Ukraine. Gregory Potemkin, who was her field marshal and her lover, I believe he was her lover as well, was establishing fake villages for her to see and demonstrate her czarist power. Yeah. And then he would pack it up and move it down the road, and then they'd do it again. Right. So essentially that's what they did to John Dewey. John Dewey goes and he sees, a bunch of kids like playing soccer in a field. They're all, marching in a straight line. They're learning about the glories of the state in the classroom, and all these kids are happy. And so he comes back home and, writes a book and a couple of other articles talking about how we need to adopt the Soviet model. This gets, really deep into the Columbia Teachers College. And so other, individuals are seeing this and buying off on it and thinking it's a great idea because it'll help form the United States into a more industrial nation state. Did they all have pernicious intent? I can't answer that, sure. But
they probably didn't have pernicious intent. I mean, even today's educators, like my wife didn't go to school for 4 years to undermine a bunch of kids' education, exactly. but the people who wrote the textbooks who don't actually train teachers to teach anything, right? They probably didn't have malintent today, but it's whatever your ideas are formed on are going to form the fruit. Like you can't exactly, if you plant an apple tree in an acid field, you're not going to get sweet tasting apples. That
is true. And even then we could debate, the intent of John Dewey. The intent
of Russia, though, is not debatable.
Exactly, right. The intent of John Dewey is relatively irrelevant, right? He was a willing accomplice, and a willing accomplice could be, Saul Alinsky calls him a useful idiot. Just somebody who's in a position that can be manipulated. And that's not me calling him a useful idiot. That's the Soviet Union and Saul Alinsky calling him a useful idiot. The two completely different approaches is, using their language, they saw an individual who could be exploited and they exploited him, and he was willing to do it. Now, he did gain a lot of prominence. He became he became a thought leader on compulsory public education.
There's hundreds of schools named after him.
And then towards the end of his life, started writing about how it was a bad idea and we needed to go back to the one-room schoolhouse. Yeah. So, that's the John Dewey, essentially the John Dewey story in a nutshell. Another one, George Counts. I think he's a 20th century individual. So he would be pure atheist because by that point the definition had moved and Protestant liberalism moved on to mean something else. And atheist is now strictly atheist. And he and his wife, and I forget the name of his wife. It's in the book as well. She and George Counts, she was actually the influence agent to Counts. She had the relationship back to the Soviet Union that influenced George Counts. And so George Counts writes a bunch of papers on the education ideas in the Soviet Union, even has his car, which was a Ford, shipped to the Soviet Union for him to drive across the Soviet Union. And he gets the Potemkin village treatment with his two, KGB minders in the vehicle. Cause by that point it's KGB, and they're driving around and he's glad handing kids and teachers and everything, talking about how great it is. And the name of that book is A Ford Crosses Russia. Yeah. It's on my read list later on down the line. So he writes this book. He comes back, and this was, I think, 1925, my timing might be a little off. So he comes back and he writes this book.
Read the book.
And
there.
It's in the book. Yeah. Get a copy of the book. It's in there.
Josh is an expert on other things.
Dates and places, not so much. So he comes back to the United States and talks about how great it is. Also part of the Columbia Teachers College, leads to a series of experiments, which are also, in the book. The Horace Mann School came from these trips from Russia. As he ages, he tries to go back to Russia to redo his trip. His KGB minders tell him no. As he starts to lose prominence, he again has a realization that maybe he, was in the middle of something he shouldn't have been in the middle in, and started also recanting a lot of the works that he had written, stating we need to go back to the one-room schoolhouse. But by that point, cat's out of the bag. Now we have, hefty taxation and, $18,000 per student, I think is what you quoted for
some people think it's higher. So,
so those are so George Counts and John Dewey are two of the main ones. But to talk about the Columbia Teachers College, and I know I'm kind of droning on, what made it so, what made it the ripe location is you have a bunch of intellectuals who are driven through experimentation. Now, experimentation isn't necessarily bad. It's you have to understand the necessities for the experimentation. And should we experiment with society? Does everything have to be a social experiment? If something is working, why change it? And so you have a group of intellectuals who, are open to innovative ideas, and the Soviet Union catches hold of it. And it's through the Columbia Teachers College that you're able to just keep this influence going. And that's where you see the Carnegie Endowment for the Arts and the Rockefeller Foundation also having their issues. Again, these aren't all people who we state would have ill intent of, destroying the United States.
Well, maybe not.
Yeah. I mean, we can talk about the things that David Rockefeller said, but we'll put that aside. To say that everybody associated with these institutions in that problem, I just don't know.
Sure.
Right? But they're positioned to use their influence, specifically in the Columbia Teachers College, to push this radical new idea that all kids should be educated by the government, and that parents should have no authority about that education, nor should I'm going to stop there. That parents should have no authority on their education.
Yeah. So the Columbia Teachers College is basically kind of the center hub that is then teaching other universities how to train teachers. And so the entire teacher training network in the United States is basically based on this communist ideology. And as we've gotten that more and more saturated inside of our society, we see a Gen Z who's now, more than 50% of them view positively socialism. Of course, we got the New York mayor who's an active socialist being educated. So to say that this long march through institutions didn't work would obviously, we see the proof in front of us that it is working. wokeandweaponized.com. Go there right now and get my new book. It outlines the history of American education and why the current public school system can't be reformed. It must be replaced. And this is a well-documented book. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin Merkel, for writing the foreword. And as Sean Ryan said, if you're a parent, read this book. Go to wokeandweaponized.com today. All right, so as we're talking about the Soviet Union and some of these ideas that they use to infiltrate the United States education system, one of them you call out is ANDEMCA. Admit nothing, deny everything, make counter accusation. And we still see that tactic being used today. So why did the Marxist-Leninists see this as a powerful tool to stop really investigations into it? And then I think I pointed out Tim Walz is a great argument of using this exact tactic today. So
it's a strong tactic. I mean, just today I was watching a reel where a young man was meeting with an intellectual, and he was conveying through fact that, America, just based on statistics, not statistical interpretation, which that's different, right? But just based on the numbers on the page, that, America, in our institutions is not inherently racist. And this is him speaking with the intellectual, and the intellectual individual went straight for Endemka with him. She admitted no support for the facts. She denied the utility of stats and stated that, statistics are, they're inherently wrong and will inherently, and statistics will lie. I'm not sure how statistics lie. It's a tool. And then she made a counter accusation where she stated that he was disrespectful and, he was not to talk to her like that. And so we have this, 40-year-old intellectual-ish, 40-ish-year-old intellectual, this 20-something, young man, and they're trying to have an exchange. And she pulled it straight out of the Münzenberg Creed, and this was a means of protecting the covert influence campaign into the cultural centers is, so even if, like, let's say John Dewey, he wrote his works, he traveled to Russia, sees these Potemkin villages, and then it comes out that he bore witness to a Potemkin village. He would not admit he was even there, even though he wrote a book. He would find a way to deflect and disengage, or to deflect and then overwhelm, right? To turn it back on the individual who, is essentially accusing, John Dewey of maybe, a little bit of intellectual, gaps in his intellect or in his approach or whatnot. And then the next step is that he even denied, or he would deny parts of the trip, no, we didn't, since I didn't see any of the gulags, they don't exist, right? So there's the denial of the gulags, right? And then makes a counter accusation of, well, you might say Russia has gulags, but how many people do the United States have are incarcerated, right? So that's essentially how the Endemka piece works, and it still, rings true today because it has a lot of power. It's a tool of changing the nature of the argument to put it back on the person asking the question. Essentially, it's a series of fallacies, right? And if you sit with a fallacy detective, which is an excellent, I think it's a Challenge A book that I would even say that parents and teachers need to sit and read it. And Endemka is essentially pulled right from the fallacy, from the 30-ish logical fallacies that we approach. Some would say it's called whataboutism, essentially a two-way fallacy. Like I'm not going to admit, any sort of agreement with what you're saying, even though it's true. I'm going to deny that your facts are accurate, and then we make a counter accusation, right? And so that's essentially, we see it. I mean, I just saw it.
You're racist. You're sexist. You're homophobic.
Is it Nick Freitas, the Virginia representative, made a point that the left diagnoses where the right tries to discourse, right? And that is a critical difference, because that diagnosis is Endemka. And so if you're talking and you're saying, we need to figure out how to solve these problems through policy measures, this is what the data is showing. And you have individuals that are applying the Münzenberg Creed, and they don't even know it's from Willi Münzenberg at this point. It's just out there. It's, it has a life of its own. And the approach
works.
It really, and it does. And they have the approach of, this is all, bunk because you're a white male that's standing up here making this conversation, this point. And that speaks to the issue with SEL and it's addressed in the book. And I know we've talked about it, at length, with when you put a 6-year-old through a form of a struggle session,
right?
Just because the teacher and the students are being nice to that 6-year-old boy doesn't mean it's not a struggle session, right? And you make him admit that he has some sort of sin for, you know, being a white male, or you make a girl admit that there's some sort of sin for being a female or whatever, right? You know, that is a form of grooming to apply Andemka and to remove critical thinking capability. That is the whole purpose of SEL. And it removes the parents' authority in their God-given right to train their children along the social emotional lines that the parents should be imparting to their children, not the state.
Yeah. So bottom line, I think from what I gathered in the Appendix B, just very well documented and researched, you know, it's the religion of atheism. Atheism is a religion. That's what their God is. And the antithesis of atheism is family, religion, and private property.
Exactly.
And they believe that it's an idea whose time has come or will come, and they just want to make sure that it's propagating itself around the globe as much as possible, because in their view, it's going to either let them control people if they're control freaks, or if they are humanitarian, they can get people to think that it's a way of evening things out and everyone's going to have their fair share. And so this Andemka thing is really interesting, because as I've been doing school choice debates and pointing out things that now are in the news, like communist China is going to make millions, if not billions of dollars on this. Now we've got Texas asking their attorney general to see if the law allows communist China to buy private schools in Texas, like they've been doing, to get the money. But when I brought that up, then I was just said, you know, they would deny that would be possible. They would say that they would admit that it couldn't happen. Then they would deny that it would be possible. And then they'd make counter arguments like, oh, you just hate poor people, as if somehow getting more people on the government dole hates poor people.
Exactly. And, you know, China is, you know, owns a sizable portion of American farmland now.
Yeah.
You know, so the argument typically when you look at somebody using Andemka, it's that they have nothing to fall back on. And right. So, you know, they accuse you of, you know, having your head in the sand or not with the times, or, you know, even then in the school choice debate, once you take government money, you are an agent of the state. As a counterintelligence agent, right? It's in my title. You know, it's important to understand that once you take government money, the state will at some point come knocking to verify what it is that you're educating. It is another means.
Unless you're in Minnesota, then you need some kid with a camcorder.
Oh, whatever works.
But no, you are an agent of the state. Like, you can define it any other way. I know exactly. Some of the school choice proponents are like, no, you're not an agent of the state. Like, they even wrote it in the law, I think, in Tennessee, that by taking this money means you're not an agent of the state, because I kept bringing it up so much. It's like, you can write in law that the sky is purple. It's still going to be blue.
I mean, you can still, you know, overregulation is a form of oppression. If we're going to use the words of the left, that's important. Overregulation is a form of oppression, and it is a tool of a radical leftist type of thinking. And even then, like, the definitions of left and right have changed, right? You know, because what does conservative, mean? You know, conservative is a 19th century or 18th, 19th century term, which meant you supported the aristocracy. So conservatism in the United States means that you support a family of economy, and you're a traditionalist, right? So even like the terms left, right have shifted to, something completely different. And so when you look at the leftist approach, right, you don't have to, like, you can impose enough regulation to where you become an agent of the state in all but name.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a critical point of this is
they're filling out paperwork,
exactly.
and getting approvals and all of these things that things that you would not do if the state wasn't requiring of it, if they were not bribing you to fill out their paperwork.
Exactly. And that's the critical point, is that all that paperwork is a form of monitoring, and it's a form of collectivization, right? It's not a form of communion. You are never in communion with your government. Even when you elect your government officials, you are not in communion with your government, right? You know, Nick Freitas, again, brings up a key point about if you want to be socialist in the United States, great. Go buy land, be socialist. And when I've had these conversations and, you know, some of the small groups that I run in about a community that chooses to approach something from a socialist standpoint, that's their choice, right? We shouldn't be imposing on communities a hefty tax burden because they choose to live a certain way. That's the critical issue that's on the table. And at this point, I would say it, you know, at least to me, it matters not about political leanings, even, you know, what your faith background is. It's just the fact that your personal sovereignty is being compromised by those who think they're smarter than you.
Yeah.
And so if you take government money, even though they write you're not an agent of the state, but then they give you mountains of things you need to do. And I mean, you could even get to the point to where the state goes, hey, we have this great idea. It's optional, but obligatory once a year for you to come to our one-room schoolhouse to meet all the other people that are homeschooling through ESA money.
Yeah.
But you're not an agent of the state. However, if you want to take the money, you're required to go to that obligatory meeting, right? So that's where the crux of the issue comes in, is even how they apply agency. And when you take it, you have agency to use it along the parameters that they set. You know, we see that in Colorado. I think you posted an excellent article about what was going on in Colorado with it. You know, Texas with you know, the Chinese buyout, and they're saying, oh, that's not going to happen. Well, it happened with our farmland.
Yeah.
And it's not a slippery slope, right? We're not looking at a slippery slope fallacy. We are looking at
this happened in our country already.
And it's going to happen again.
The same policies. There's similar policies. So what was the number one surprise you had? Because, I mean, you were familiar with a lot of these tactics that the left use based on your history in the military, but you hadn't really dug down deep into all the documents. So what is something that was surprising to you?
That's a good question. I think the biggest surprise to me was seeing all these institutions in the 19th century, which were enjoying the fruits of their labor and positioning themselves to exploit the posterity. I think, and so I know that that's kind of a mouthful, but you know, I grew up thinking the Columbia Teachers College was an innovative, you know, institution of educational thinking. I grew up, you know, supporting donations to the Carnegie Endowment of the Arts and the Rockefeller Foundation, because we are taught that these institutions are safeguarding the public good. They're safeguarding our culture. But so when I say they're enjoying their fruits, then I think the biggest eye-opening piece, the most surprising piece, was just how willfully ignorant we were as Americans at that time to not catch what was going on, or to not question the value propositions that were being offered us, was a big one. Also, the role of educators in the Soviet Union, the educational exchanges that were had was eye-opening. There's whole journals written in the Soviet Union in the 18th or in the 19th and 20th centuries. Excuse me, I'm sorry, in the 20th century after the Bolshevik Revolution. There's whole journals written by American educational thought leaders into the Soviet Union to help them better, establish their modicum of control through education. The United States wrote textbooks for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wrote textbooks for the United States.
Yeah.
So that level of exchange where some would say, oh, that's good. That's showing partnership. That's showing X. That's showing Y. The problem is not the engagement between the Soviet Union and the United States. I don't look at the Soviet Union and say, you're the main enemy. It's that the United States was imposing the ideas. These thinkers in the United States were imposing the ideas of the Soviet Union. It was not a choice. It was not an asker. It was, oh, this came out of the Columbia Teachers College. I want to maintain my level of prestige and prominence. So we're going to implement it and then, do some data analysis and send it back so we can continue to take money. I think that's the other one, is how much we were willing to sell ourselves out for some idea of pseudo economy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, we're $38 trillion as of this recording in national debt, probably 39 trillion maybe by the time you're watching it, enough time passes. And we have robbed our children's children of their future in order to enrich ourselves. And of course, we've all done that because of the education that we've gotten and the lack of respect for ourselves and our families and private property. And so go pick up your copy of Woke and Weaponized, How Karl Marx Won the Battle for American Education and How to Win It Back. It's on Amazon.com now. Be sure to read the entire book because it is very eye-opening. And, on the back of the book, it says, from Karl Marx's 1848 call for free education in public schools to today's UNESCO-driven global agendas. You'll be surprised. You mentioned earlier that Karl Marx was writing about what was going on in England. Find out what they called public schools in England by picking up your book today. You will be shocked. So please share this episode with a friend. Be sure to tune in to all of this week's School Choice Week interviews as we go through the book Woke and Weaponized and debunk the lies that the school choice proponents are feeding you so that you can live free. Remember, at Refining Rhetoric, we want you to not be woke, but be wise. Until next time, God bless.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortins. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation. And visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.